Good morning, how are you today? So, what I'll talk about today is two related topics. One of them is escalation of force, and the other one is target either identification or target discrimination. Now, these are two related topics, and there are a few nuances to this that I want to get across, so please bear with me on this. I have a few opinions. I just want to make some points in general. So, firstly, escalation of force. So, what does this mean? So, generally, if you're in something like the military or law enforcement, this can actually be specifically laid down as a process, and I will give examples of that. But generally, if you're a civilian, your escalation of force is going to be something that is your use of violence is going to be escalated to meet the threat. In fact, not just meet the threat, because ultimately you need to use enough force to hopefully defeat any threat that comes at you without it being unreasonable. What is unreasonable? That's another interesting nuance to talk about. So obviously, we don't want to sort of fight fair in a way that is going to, allow the attacker to win, especially when our lives and safety and those of our loved ones are in play. But at the same time, you don't. Once you get to a court of law, you've got to make sure that that's not totally disproportionate and not totally unreasonable. So we've got the reasonable man situation where what would a reasonable man have done? This is not a legal talk. I'm not an attorney. But that's an interesting nuance. So we would escalate force in order to defeat the threat. That doesn't even get into avoidance. It doesn't get into any of all those other things. I don't want to get too far down rabbit holes on this. But ultimately, we end up in a situation where we have a threat, and therefore escalation of force is going to escalate in order to meet and hopefully defeat the threat that is presented to us. So that's interesting. An example of escalation of force, so a good example would be convoy procedures in somewhere like Iraq or Afghanistan. So over the years, I've sort of fulfilled all these roles, various roles in terms of, been a gunner, been a driver, been a vehicle commander on these moves, and so have first-hand experienced this. Now, escalation of force was laid down as a specific set of procedures that you would do, and what I'm referring to here is, and this was applicable to people on mopeds, people on foot, but I'm specifically talking about here if you're driving in a convoy or a vehicle packet, and the threat is suicide vehicle bombs. And I know that is not a day-to-day situation, but I'm just going to use it as an example. So the idea is that you would display signs if you're in a high-profile move, and those signs would say, stay back 100 meters. And the idea would be to keep traffic at 100 meters from your vehicles to reduce the threat of suicide vehicle-borne IEDs. And therefore, to make that happen, various people would have the job, for example, you might be the rear gunner, would have the job of keeping that traffic back. And there would be a sort of a set of laid down procedures. So, you would signal, you would have maybe a flag, you would have pen flares, and you would sort of escalate through these procedures. And they changed over time. At one point it would include, as you escalate, it would fire warning shots and fire into the engine block, and then that was sort of considered, if I recall correctly, that wasn't going to stop the vehicle in time. And ultimately this would escalate to firing through the windshield at the driver. And what was key to these escalation of force procedures was that if you had time, you would sort of escalate through the various warnings, and ultimately, hopefully, you wouldn't ever get to the use of deadly force. If something happened to you extremely quickly, as in, it just happened really fast, then you would then just immediately escalate to whatever was necessary. So, normally, you might be waving a red flag and then there's a pen flare, so fire the pen flare and hopefully he gets the idea. But if suddenly, boom, here comes that vehicle accelerating towards the convoy, then you would have maybe have no choice but to escalate to deadly force through the windshield at the driver. And actually, as an aside, it's a terrible thing because none of us really should be wanting to take life. And yet, when you go to these countries, people are often idiots when it comes to driving. So, there's a nuance there to, do you really want to be firing through the windshield of this car? Is the guy an idiot? And that's just a separate thing I'm going to talk about in a minute. So, so there's a nuance there. There's two sides to this, and this is really what I wanted to get at. When you have escalation of force measures or guidelines or rules for the use of force, one of the problems that I see is, and this might be probably not so much in a military sense, but I think maybe, in a law enforcement sense, and often, civilians will get themselves in trouble with this, is that because people want an outcome, and this could even be as bad as like a young guy wants to get kills, etc., because, that's going to make him feel better, whatever. So people will try and fit those rules to achieve the outcome that they want, which is to actually use deadly force. And ultimately, in a professional, moral environment, we do not actually want to be using deadly force if we can avoid it. And that's just, all this stuff you see out there on the gram and, all this stuff about dirt naps and stacking bodies and I don't know. I mean, it must have been pretty terrible on the fob when you were stacking bodies, but I digress. But, I mean, if you're a professional, you don't really want to be stacking bodies, okay? You want to be achieving a mission, and, I don't want to digress too much. So, there are times and there are places. Generally, if you're going to go around, using deadly force when it's inappropriate, all you're going to do is you're going to turn the population against you. And I realize I'm sort of digressing into, other situations that aren't necessarily applicable to a domestic situation, in the United States, but I think I was making my point. Now, so I think that what's important, and you can see this when I remember looking at a forum, someone had posted sort of a question online somewhere, and of course it was like in a gun sort of forum, and there was sort of a bit of a video of someone in a vehicle and someone sort of aggressively approaching the vehicle, almost like a sort of road ragey situation. No weapons visible, nothing like this. And of course, what's everyone going to say? Shoot him! I'm sure if it was a samurai sword forum, then it would have been leap out of the car and, lop his head off. So, I mean, this is the tools that the guys are interested in. This is the tools that they want to use. So, and it was clear that that was not an appropriate response. If you want to go to jail, maybe. And, if you're in a vehicle, then the vehicle itself is not only an escape mechanism, but also it's actually, if necessary, a weapon to get out of there too. So you got to think. So what this leads me to talk about is I think what's missing in a lot of this is training and judgment. And what goes hand in hand with that is personal courage. Especially if you're going, and confidence, especially if you're going to do this in a professional manner. Maybe you're in law enforcement. If you don't have personal courage, if you don't have confidence because perhaps you've never done, for example, you have no confidence at all in hand-to-hand skills, that kind of thing, then you're naturally immediately going to start escalating towards deadly force when it's not necessarily appropriate. And this is one side of it. This is one of the points that I wanted to make. If you can develop some kind of confidence and you have courage, then you're going to be able to employ judgment and hopefully avoid outcomes that ultimately might not be necessary and we don't really want to happen. If you're just some kid who wants to get a kill, then I'm sure you can fit those rules of engagement to whatever situation you want. He was reaching for his waistband, etc., etc. Okay? we have good training, if we have personal courage, if we have confidence, then we have the ability to employ good judgment to a situation. Now, the flip side to that, and that is not to say, I gave you the example before when I was talking about, you know, the escalation of force for like potential suicide vehicles coming in, is that ultimately, if it does happen fast, you have to have no hesitation of escalating towards what is necessary, because if you've therefore, you know, now you're feeling all, you know, sort of, what's the word, you know, you have to be prepared to escalate as necessary. So that's the flip side of what I'm saying, and hopefully you, listening to this, you can gather the nuances of what I'm saying. What I didn't say a minute ago was never escalate to deadly force. I said if you've got some good training, if you've got personal courage, if you've got some confidence, then you may then, utilizing that situation, you may then have the ability to exercise best judgment. And it may be that deadly force or any kind of force is not necessary. A lot of situations are sort of situational. And you know, if you alter the situation, you can change the dynamic. But the perfect example is suddenly there's a vehicle, boom, coming straight at you, and he's, you know, now he's at 85 meters. Now he's at 50 meters. Is he just an idiot driver, or is he actually a suicide bomber? Well, at that moment, you don't have any choice. This is the flip side, because you have a duty. Your job is a duty to keep your people alive, force protection. And therefore, if that happens quick, then you got to go. You got to go. So, you know, if you have, and denial is a big issue with that. You've got to be ready to go when you need to go. So, if you're ever in a situation, whether you, whatever your sort of situation is, I mean, it could be, you know, if you're, you know, preparing for without rule of law situations, that kind of thing, and you're thinking about how are we going to defend our location against bad guys coming in, that kind of thing. You've got to think about what your rules for the use of force, escalation of force measures are going to be. And you've got to make sure that if you say, you know, we're going to warn people. If they keep coming, blah, 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 we'll tell them that, you know, deadly force will be used against them. And then if they get to the certain point, we'll use deadly force. Well, at that point, you need to be prepared to use deadly force, because it can't just be, you know, a false bluff. So there's two sides to this. Exercising of judgment, and then the ability to actually execute a level of force appropriate to the situation when it's actually necessary. You could say walk softly and carry a big stick. Now, so those are a few nuances I just wanted to talk about. I find it generally disappointing the way I see people trying to fit, you know, actions to rules for the use of force, or using escalation of force measure as a kind of excuse to use violence or deadly force, when really that shouldn't be your primary focus. Your primary focus should be to avoid that situation. The other side of this is target discrimination. Blue on blue, fratricide, is a big thing. It's probably a bigger thing than people realize. When we run force-on-force team tactics training, you know, we discovered this. As soon as you get the force-on-force UTM rounds out, people go nuts. You might have had them doing some great drills. You know, it could be a CQB situation. You know, you've got them doing some great drills. As soon as you add force-on-force to it, boom, people go nuts. And so I remember specifically on a force-on-force team tactics event, a team had taken casualties and was trying to break contact. This is in the woods, and there was sort of some down trees or sort of scrub blocking, and these two guys were basically bounding back to break contact away from this superior enemy force that sort of, you know, gained the initiative over them and caused casualties. And as they were bounding back, the guy moved back. He takes a fire position. His buddy comes back on the other side of the scrub, and next thing he sees him, boom, boom, boom. Are you serious? You just killed your buddy. Kind of happens a lot, and it's terrifying when you got the idea of like untrained people in a situation utilizing firearms, you pretty much want to like low crawl and just like kind of crawl out of that area because it's going to be absolutely terrifying. Training. People need training, and people need training on target discrimination. We jumped all over that, and we made some specific sort of rules for force on force that make people think. And the rule is that if you commit a blue on blue act, then not only does the guy that you shot have to act appropriately as the casualty that he is, so he's gone, but you yourself are out. You're done. And that gives people pause. Because can you imagine, in reality, if you're just loosing off rounds at everything you see, and, you know, therefore, you know, that could be friends, family, whatever, that you're just in your chaos and panic, you are just basically wiping out anything that moves. You've got to train target discrimination. It's why when we do CQB training, we'll have shoot and no shoot targets. You've got to figure out how to do that on the flat range. You've got to figure out how to make people think before they pull the trigger. And this is another one of these issues with some of the training you see out there, which is basically how fast can I shoot? You know, shot timer stuff, how fast can I do this, how fast can I do that? And what that doesn't necessarily involve is any thought process onto shoot or no shoot. It's going to be situationally dependent, but you're going to have to make decisions, and depending on the actual situation you're in, it depends whether this, you know, sort of how much the escalation of force, you know, are you in a full-on firefight? Are you in some other kind of layered situation? But obviously the rules, escalation for use of force is going to play into this. And then, you know, if deadly force is appropriate, we need to then consider who it is that we're actually targeting. You know, what's big right now, things like school shootings. So let's say you were responding to a school shooting or any other kind of active shooter situation or active murderer situation, which is probably what it should be called. And you you're in a mall. You clearly cannot just engage everything that's out there. You have to try and discriminate who the actual murderer is before you engage. You have to discriminate between other people that might be armed, concealed carry, holders, that kind of thing. So just target discrimination is extremely important. If you just go to the range, pew pew as fast as you can, you're not learning target discrimination. So I think that what is missing, and the nuances that I'm trying to put across here today, are that what is missing is often a good level of training. What's also sometimes missing is personal courage, which allows you to use better judgment. If you're just in fear, you're not going to employ good judgment. It's not to say that you will not experience fear. We all know what bravery is. Bravery is the ability to do it despite the fear. But if you have that element of personal courage that you can control the fear, and therefore you've got more of a chance of acting on good judgment. And that's going to come from training and experience. It ultimately, you know, it's about professionalism. If you're a professional soldier, you're probably less likely to pull the trigger than someone that's, you know, not quite so professional, not quite so experienced. And we can utilize good judgment and apply that to situations. We also need to then move that into the area of target discrimination and target identification to make sure we do not shoot the wrong people and use deadly force against the wrong people. I hope that wasn't too jumbled today. There was kind of quite a few thoughts in there. I'm going to have a look at this, see whether it makes sense. And but there are a few nuances. If you just seize on any of my words, I think, you know, there could be some, you know, comments about this. But hopefully the nuance is clear in what I'm trying to say. Thank you very much.